going to discuss about cubitus varus as a short case here. So many of the things have been dealt before excellently. So the disclosures, the patients and the parents have given permission to use the images. And before going into the topic, I would like to emphasize that always remember certain things before in the examination actually. So it's maybe we may be apprehensive in the examination as a postgraduate, but we have to remember these points. We must be gentle with the child and be considerate with the parents actually. You cannot jump upon a child examining him without explaining to the parent what you're going to do, or you have to talk to the child to gain a rapport so that you are able to perform your examination in a better way. And as it has been emphasized repeatedly by the first two speakers, you have a normal side in an elbow examination, and always examine the normal side first. It helps in two ways. It helps in gaining the confidence that you're not going to hurt the child. And the second thing is, it helps the normal values to be recorded so that you're able to compare the abnormal side with the normal side. And also it's important to mark your points for demonstration. For example, if you're going to talk about the arm length, and if you're not marked your angle of acromion, then the examiner will not be satisfied that you have measured the arm length actually. So let's go into the topic itself. So as a short case, I'm going to start with the diagnosis. And it has been rightly said repeatedly that in an upper limb case, it's very essential to mention the dominance of the the upper limb at the diagnosis actually. So let's start our diagnosis like this. It's a 6 years old male child with dominance of right hand. Now coming to the diagnosis, you will have three parts here: the anatomical part, the etiology, and the pathology. So what's the anatomy? There is a deformation. There is a cubitus varus deformation of around 30 degrees on the left side of this child. So what's the etiology? The etiology is a trauma. So it's a post-traumatic cubitus varus deformation of the elbow. And what's the pathology here? The pathology is a malunited supracondylar humerus fracture in this child. And what are the other things that can be added in the diagnosis? Maybe the duration of the problem, as well as, very importantly, you should not be missing any neurological deficit or any kind of active functional deficit as mentioned, like a restricted range of motion. So this is the comprehensive diagnosis: a 6 years old male child with dominant right upper limb. He comes with the cubitus varus of around 30 degrees in the left side. It's post-traumatic. It's because of malunited supracondylar humerus fracture without any neurological deficit. So now, once you have given the diagnosis, the examiner will be asking you, come on, let's dissect the diagnosis and tell me why you have come to this diagnosis actually. So first things first, why do I call it a cubitus varus? Very important. The full elbow extension is mandatory to call it as a cubitus varus. If you're not able to get a full extension in the elbow, you will not give a diagnosis of cubitus varus. Second thing, these definitions are very important to be remembered because they can be asked at any point of your examination. So what is a cubitus varus? It is loss or reversal of the normal carrying angle between the arm and the forearm. And what is a carrying angle? It's the outward angulation of the supinated forearm at the extended elbow. So these words are not to be missed. It's a supinated forearm at the extended elbow. It's very important. And the range, the normal range has been mentioned before. It's 5 to 15. It's 5 to 10 in men, in boys, and around 10 to 15 degrees in girls. So we have a diagnosis about cubitus varus. Now coming to the etiology, why it's a post-traumatic cubitus varus or a malunited supracondylar humerus fracture. So if you in your outpatient clinic, you will be seeing that every child who comes to the outpatient clinic, the parent or the attendant will be giving a history of trauma. So it's our responsibility to see that whether the trauma is a significant trauma or just a coincidental trauma. Or so what is a significant trauma? A significant trauma is one where the symptoms start immediately after the injury, and the injury is of that extent that it incapacitates the limb and it requires a intervention. So here this boy had fall from a cycle and he was not able to use the left upper limb, and he was taken to a traditional bone setter who had given him a splintage for a period of 2 weeks. So it's very important to ascertain that the trauma is a significant trauma. Then what next? The examiner will be interested in asking you, come on, tell me the positive findings, why you are giving me this diagnosis of a cubitus varus because of a malunited supracondylar humerus fracture. So from history, you can get certain points like history of significant trauma, as we discussed, the deformity appreciated as soon as the full extension of elbow was achieved, and it's a non-progressive deformity. So this part of the history may be difficult, but at times we can ascertain that it's a non-progressive deformity, and many a times there is no limitation of activities of daily living in a patient with an isolated cubitus varus deformation. Now coming to the examination proper. So inspection, we saw that we have to first assess the alignment and attitude. So it's again, I'm telling full extension is mandatory, otherwise don't give the diagnosis as cubitus varus. There is an inner or medial deviation of the forearm, and inspection from side at times may reveal hyperextension at the elbow, but the hyperextension is visualized when the shoulder is flexed actually. So you may be able to appreciate this, and at times there may be fullness in the cubital fossa if the distal fragment is in gross extension due to the prominence of the proximal fragment, or there may be a myositis mass which has to be examined. And don't forget to mention about the injury marks or scars from surgery. So palpation, so we Professor Lalit Meni was explaining it excellently. So we have to ascertain two important things here. For this diagnosis, I should have a thickening of the medial and lateral supracondylar ridges. So as I told, as it has been mentioned, always compare with the normal side, and you have to ascertain that there is a thickening of the medial and lateral supracondylar ridges, and the 3-point bony relationship is not altered when compared with the opposite side. These 2 points are very important to come to a conclusion that there is a cubitus varus due to a malunited supracondylohumerus fracture. One common mistake in examination is marking the medial epicondyle as the tip of the olecranon. So it is very important that you trace the ulna from distal to proximal and mark the olecranon properly, because in cases with gross deformation, these 2 points may be close enough to confuse you. So it's very important you ascertain it and mark it properly. So these are some pictures showing a palpation of the supracondylar ridges. I prefer palpating into the posterior aspect because I can compare both of them at the same time. And you're just assessing the 3-point bony relationship here. So here there is a medial tilt or a varus malunion. So the triangle is tilted, but it's not altered actually. So this is the medial epicondyle, the lateral epicondyle, and the tip of the olecranon. The triangle dimensions are the same, but it may be tilted, but the dimensions are the same. So you are going to say that the triangle is unaltered. But you have to remember that in case of long-standing cases, very rarely you can have a deviation from this normal relationship. That has to be kept in mind. Don't go from this lecture that the 3-point is always altered in a supracondylohumerus fracture. It may be, it has been found, and it has been documented even by our Professor Hardas Singh Sandhu, that in long-standing cases, due to the medialization of the triceps, there may be a medial and proximal migration of the olecranon tip, and the triangle may be altered in a long-standing case. But in the most of the time in exams, you don't get these kind of cases, and you will be having a normal relationship. And what triangle it is, it has been discussed repeatedly. It's a scalene. As per our investigation, we did the study on 200 patients. So, but remember, you have other side to compare with, and you can say that the triangle is comparable on both the sides, and it's not going to be an issue if you're going to say whether it is a scalene or an isosceles triangle. So what are the positive findings regarding movements? So it's like look, feel, and move. So now coming to the movements, we know that in a malunited supracondylohumerus fracture, the distal fragment is posteriorly tilted, or it is in extension. So you may be able to appreciate that the extension is exaggerated and the flexion is a deficit compared to the normal side. So the arc of rotation has changed. It is not essentially a reduction in the range of motion. It is the arc that has been shifted actually. And so if there is a 0 to 140 degrees on the normal side, it may be minus 20 to 120 degree on the affected side. So there is an exaggerated extension and the flexion may be reduced. Remember, but there are at times where you may have a true restriction of range of motion regarding flexion, where you have a gross extension of the distal fragment and the proximal fragment forms a bony ledge, which gives a bony block to have attained full flexion. Also, it was excellently described how to check for pronation and supination. So this is how we check for pronation and supination. And as the distal fragment has tilted a little bit medially, you may have a little bit increase in supination and a restriction of pronation, but it's not usually it's not appreciated in every case. So now coming to the demonstration of an exaggeration of internal rotation at the shoulder joint, which is an essential component of a malunited supracondylar humerus fracture. So, so why there is an exaggerated internal rotation at the shoulder joint? Because of the fragment getting, distal fragment getting internally rotated, that it appears that it is an exaggerated internal rotation. So what are the ways of demonstrating it? One way is to abduct the arm to 90 degrees and flex the elbow to 90 degrees, and then you can compare the rotation on both the sides, and you can demonstrate to the examiner that there is an increase in internal rotation. The other way is to ask the patient to flex forward, and you can extend the shoulder as shown here and flex the elbow to 90 degrees so that the forearm forms a lever, and the distance between the back and the dorsum of forearm can be seen to be exaggerated in the side which is affected. So this is a Yamamoto sign, and it's not necessary to name any signs in your exam unless otherwise you are asked for. You're going to just demonstrate that there is an exaggeration of internal rotation at the shoulder joint. So these two findings are very important. Just like your thickening of supracondylar ridges and a maintained 3-point bony relationship, a demonstration of hyperextension and demonstration of exaggerated internal rotation is very important when you are going to come to a conclusive diagnosis of a malunited supracondylar humerus fracture. So measurements, we saw how to measure the carrying angle, and we can also measure the arm length, and we can measure the 3-point bony relationship using a vernier caliper as shown here. So you will be asked to summarize what are your positive findings. So by history, there is a significant trauma usually on fall on an outstretched hand. With on examination, I am able to appreciate that the forearm is deviated medially, and by palpation, I'm able to appreciate that there is a thickening of supracondylar ridges on either side with a maintained 3-point bony relationship. And further examining, I was able to appreciate that there is a hyperextension at the involved elbow, and there is an exaggerated internal rotation of the involved of the shoulder joint on the same side. So these things are important. The examiner may be interested to know what are the displacements of the distal fragment. There may be a medial tilt, and as a result, there may be angulation on the lateral side, and there is a medial or internal rotation, and there is a posterior tilt and an anterior angulation and proximal migration if there is a gross deformation. And what are the differentials? What are the differentials? So many times you will be able to give a conclusive diagnosis based upon the findings you are able to accumulate in your examination. But at times the examiner may be interested in asking you differentials. So you should be clear to say whether you are giving differentials to the case you are examining, or as such you are giving differentials to the diagnosis what you have told. So I can say for my case, I am sure that this is a case of a malunited supracondylar humerus fracture, but the other conditions that can lead to a cubitus varus. So the commonest one is a lateral condylar humerus fracture. So why does it happen? In a lateral condylar humerus fracture, there is a post-traumatic physeal stimulation during fracture healing with subsequent lateral overgrowth, but it's not a gross deformation. And two important points which will help you to differentiate this from a malunited supracondylar humerus fracture is absence of hyperextension and absence of exaggerated internal rotation. So this is why we emphasized that just like thickening of ridges and 3-point bony relationship, it's very important to assess whether the patient has an extension, hyperextension and an exaggerated internal rotation, though, so that you are able to come to this diagnosis. So this is an example of a child with a lateral condylar humerus fracture who has a cubitus varus. When compared to the other side, you may be able to appreciate that there is an exaggerated growth on the lateral aspect. So other differentials like progressive varus can happen when there is a physeal arrest, there is a medial arrest and a lateral overgrowth, or there is a trochlear avian. So these differentials are to be kept in mind when in doubt. And so once you have come to the diagnosis, once you are able to convince that you have diagnosed this patient, so the next question is how will you confirm your diagnosis? So we had a very good lecture on radiology. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to get a radiology of the distal humerus, AP and lateral, and a full length X-ray of the arm and forearm centered over the elbow to quantify the varus. So we had a lot of discussion on Bowman's. We have a diaphyseal line along the humerus and a tangential line along the capillary epiphysis, and the greater angle here represents the Bowman angle, the normal being around 77 to 80 and 81 degrees, which he himself denoted. So the other thing is the passage of anterior humeral line and your capitulum being extended, passing being the line being anterior to the capitulum which means that the distal fragment is in extension. And also there is a overlapping between this physis and the proximal ulna, creating a crescent. This is known as the crescent sign, which may be seen in these cases. And to quantify radiologically the deformity, you can use the humeral wrist elbow wrist angle of Oppenheim to quantify this deformation and to plan your surgery. So the next question in an exam will be, how will you manage? So how will you manage? So should I do anything for this patient? Because it's many of times it is only a cosmetic concern. So the child, and remember the child will not be having any kind of limitation in his or her limitation in activities of daily living. The parents may be concerned because of the crooked appearance of the limb, and that may be the only concern. And it's your duty to counsel the parents regarding the few possible complications of an intervention here, so that they should make up a mind whether they want a surgery or not. It's not like every single patient who is going to walk into your outpatient clinic with a cubitus varus deformation will be going out with a surgery done on them. So that's not the case. So here it's a cosmetic concern as far as examination is concerned for you, and it has to be counseled with the parents regarding, and you have to explain about the complications, possible complications like stiffness, loss of reduction, and infection, everything with the parents, and they have to take a call whether they want to get this one done or not. But is it only a cosmetic deformation? So there are studies in literature. This is only to enlighten you that there are concerns in a grown-up adult because of a childhood cubitus varus deformation. The child will not have an issue, but when the child grows into an adult, they may have an issue. This is just for you to know if the examiner is going to ask you repeatedly, sir, is it always a benign condition? So there are conditions like posterolateral rotatory instability and ulnar neuropathy or snapping triceps in these conditions, which you just remember them. You need not tell them in every single case. But these kids are more prone for lateral condyle humerus fractures, which is to be remembered. And why does it happen? Because usually the lateral condyle or the capsular physis is perpendicular to the radius here. But in a pronated arm, forearm, and in a varus deformation, it becomes tangential or parallel to this radial radius, and any force that is going to be transferred in a minimally flexed and pronated forearm is going to be transferred into a shear force in the distal humerus, which is going to increase the propensity for a lateral condyle humerus fracture. These things are just for you to know, but you're not going to say this thing in every examination that is going to be you're going to appear. So the question is, how will you manage this case? Are you going to observe? Are you going to do a growth modulation where you're going to arrest the physeal growth on the opposite side so that you get a reversal of the deformation? So both these things are not going to change anything, because you know that the distal humerus contributes only to 20% of growth of the length of humerus. And in a child more than 6 years of age, there is not much growth left in the distal humerus, and none of this is going to change the outcome. So if you have counseled the parents and if you want to correct the deformity, then you have to go for an osteotomy. So what are the questions that can be asked regarding the osteotomy? When are you going to do an osteotomy in a child who comes to you today after a supracondylar humerus fracture? What kind of osteotomy are you going to decide upon? And how is you going to calculate the amount of wedge that you're going to remove when you're going to do an osteotomy? So the first question, when to do an osteotomy? The regular answer is we are going to wait for at least a period of 1 year to assess any disturbance in growth if it is going to happen, so that we are able to diagnose a progressive varus. And also in a very young child, the sagittal plane, that is the hyperextension, remodels to a little extent, which can be allowed to happen. So it's about a year you will wait before going for any kind of intervention. And before going to the type of osteotomy, I will just show this slide, that it's always a dictum that if I'm going to correct 1 degree, I'm going to take a wedge with base of 1 millimeter. But that's not the case in every single bone or every single case you're going to manage, because it depends upon the width of the bone. So if the width of the bone increases with the same amount of angle here, your base of the wedge increases. So see, if the width is increasing, the wedge also increases. It also increases. So it doesn't depend upon the you cannot apply this dictum everywhere actually. So what we usually do for doing a supracondylar corrective osteotomy, we usually trace the normal limb and we superimpose the affected limb and calculate the wedge based upon the calibration. There are few formulas available. I'm not going to go into that, but the most commonly done technique is to trace, do a paper tracing and then template the amount of wedge that we're going to remove. Now coming to the osteotomies. So what are the various osteotomies that can be done for a cubitus varus deformation? Most commonly done is a lateral closing wedge osteotomy, or you can do a medial opening wedge osteotomy. You can do a oblique osteotomy, and there are variations of the lateral closing wedge like a step cut, a reverse step cut, or a dome osteotomy. So the most commonly done is the lateral closing wedge osteotomy. So here, if you see the picture, when I do a lateral closing wedge, what happens is there is a prominence on the lateral side. The lateral condyle becomes more prominent and unsightly. So I have to translate the distal fragment also medially. So lateral closing wedge osteotomy, when we translate, it becomes unstable, but so it demands a fixation. Otherwise, it's more stable than a medial opening wedge osteotomy, where you have to use a bone graft, and also there is a risk of stretching the neurovascular structures, which has to be kept in mind. And this is the classic paper by French in Lancet, where he uses a lateral closing wedge and he uses 2 screws. And if you see the distal screw, it is placed anteriorly so that he does both correction of varus as well as derotation of the distal fragment. This technique has been modified by Bellimore. And one favorite question in examination is, what is the difference between a French and a modified French technique? So in French technique, the incision is posterior. In a modified French, the incision is posterolateral. In French, you lift the lateral half of the triceps. In modified French, you lift the lateral 1/3 of the triceps, that is detached and reflected proximally to approach the distal humerus. In French, you explore the ulnar nerve. In modified French, you do not explore the ulnar nerve because you go subperiosteally. And one important thing is, in French osteotomy, he leaves the medial periosteum intact. And in modified French, he leaves in Bellimore's technique, he leaves a part of the cortex intact, which will be broken during the maneuver to correct the deformation. So these are the basic differences between a French and a modified French, which are lateral closing wedge osteotomies, and they incorporate both varus correction as well as torsional correction here. Other osteotomy techniques are like step cut osteotomy, where you leave a spike of bone here, and it's supposed to add stability as well as you can fix this distal fragment with a proximal fragment through 1 screw. But this technique may not be applicable in a bigger child because 1 screw is not sufficient. And so we do a modification of the step cut, a reverse step cut, where the apex of the triangle is directed proximally. So why do we do these techniques? Because we want to avoid the lateral prominence so that the fragment is also translated medially, thereby avoiding the lateral prominence. So I end up my discussion.